I welcome all of you to this Global Medical Education Cafe. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ramani.
Thanks, Eric. So it's Shubha. That's fine. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Aileen Barrett, whom I've gotten to know through being an associate editor on the Clinical Teacher. And you'll see a theme. You're going to be meeting other editors, in the peer review series, but this is very special. And Aileen Barrett is an associate scheme director on the Southeast GP training program in Waterford, Ireland. She's a physiotherapist in her clinical discipline. She completed a PhD in medical education at University College Cork and has a special interest in feedback, mentor-based assessment, faculty development, and clinical teaching in the health professions. In 2019, Aileen led the development of EPAs for GP training in Ireland and the design of workplace-based assessment tools to support GP trainee learning. That's general practitioner, so family medicine, internal medicine on the UK and Ireland front. As a member of Exquisite, the European Centre of Excellence in Qualitative Inquiry and Study in Training and Education, Aileen has published a number of papers on qualitative research methods and is a research supervisor on the Masters of Health Sciences Clinical Education at National University of Ireland, Galway. And she's been appointed editor-in-chief of the Clinical Teacher in 2020. So over to Aileen.
Oh, Shubha, thank you for such a lovely introduction, and to all of you for such a lovely welcome and invitation to speak to you all today. I am so interested and amazed by the work that you do to build this community of scholarship. And to be invited to meet you today, I'm just delighted. And I hope you'll take the opportunity to ask any questions that you have always wanted to ask. I remember the first time I went to a meeting and Kevin Eva was there as editor of medical education and had a session where you could meet the editor and ask all those questions that you never understood about the publication process. And it was just enlightening. And, it's, and I work very closely with him in this role because obviously we're an ASME Wiley publication. And I know what it's like to have access and to ask those questions in real time. So please use your chat box. And Christina, you just give me a nudge whenever anybody has a question as well. I don't really have slides. They were more to prompt me as to what I might share with you today. So I'm just going to pop these up here. And you might let me know that, Christina, you can see all those. Great. Shubha's invitation was specifically to talk about nurturing educational scholarship. And as I said, it could not be a topic that's closer to my heart for a number of different reasons. And Christina and I just talked about this briefly about professional identity changes and evolutions. I feel like I've reinvented myself, maybe more than Madonna at this stage. And when I started as a physiotherapist, I can say 20 years ago, this is not where I thought I would be. I didn't think there was an avenue to do this as a physiotherapist. And for those of you who are working in health professions education, when I started, we really only talked about medical education. And I felt that that was a world in which I maybe wasn't welcome or couldn't enter. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And I think the evolution now where we talk about health professions in general, and we recognize the synergies and similarities and commonalities between us all has been a massive shift in what we do in educational scholarship. I've been so hugely fortunate in my career to have had these serendipitous encounters with educational researchers and scholars who have come to support me in so many different, explicit ways in terms of supervising research, but also those hidden ways where I've had people who mentored me informally. We didn't have, a formal mentoring system here or anything like that, but I've had people who've encouraged me and who have presented me with opportunities that possibly at the time were slightly terrifying, but I'm so glad I took them. In hindsight, there were some sleepless nights, and there still are, I can tell you, along the way, particularly when I started this role. And as I say, my journey into education has been probably in some ways predetermined. I am the daughter of a primary school teacher and a midwife, so maybe health professions education was always where I was going to end up. But this world is so welcoming and so collaborative and encouraging, but so dynamic. and the change and the rate of change of what's happening in scholarship is just phenomenal. And I'm hugely fortunate to be in this position as an editor where I get to read everybody else's amazing work and I don't have to do it. I get to read about what everybody else does. And that's a really amazing place to be. So today I just thought I'd fill you in a little bit on my story, because sometimes it helps to put a face to a name, particularly when you're submitting to a journal. And I do think there's a sense of submitting sometimes to this black hole, and you don't know where your paper is going to go, when it's going to come back. Is anyone going to speak to you about it? And I think when you know that there is actually a real person who is going to look at your paper, that might encourage you to do that as well. And that's the same at every journal. So while today I thought I would talk about our TCT vision, I'm more interested in your story and your vision for your educational scholarship impact. And that's really what we want to talk about today. But in terms of the journal, and particularly at the Clinical Teacher, I could not have predicted the amazing team I get to work with. And to have people, particularly Shubha, has come to me with these amazing ideas, and we have found this synergy in our perspectives on what it is to nurture scholarship. And as she says, we do hate to hit the reject button. We still do it. But what we hope at TCT is that we do it in a way that is supportive and at least constructive. We've all been in that place where we've had that rejection email that's so deflating that you put that piece of work away and you think, I'm never actually going to look at this again. What we hope that we do is when we reject, that we do provide some level of interpretation or understanding of why that particular paper at this particular place in time is not suitable for publication, but also that we give some guidance as to how people might go about further developing their work. Is usually the problem. It's sometimes that it's just a little bit too early. We have a really Irish expression that says when something's a little bit early, we say it's a little bit previous. It's a really Irish expression, but it means that it's just not quite ready just yet. And that would be certainly quite a number of papers that we receive. Those good ideas, we tried them out a little bit, but they actually need a little bit more development. So those are the ones where we do spend quite a bit of time on that feedback as well. But in terms of a journal's position, I think we do have a reputation as, a defense wall, and that our role is to reject until otherwise proven. And I really wanted to change that narrative and certainly to make that more explicit for you today. That actually what certainly I didn't really realize coming into the role was that I would feel this responsibility to authors, to the field, to the peer reviewers, and to the audience we serve. And that for me is critical, that our journal is in a unique position. We are there to support clinical teachers in their scholarly endeavors, be that as authors or as teachers. And certainly for me, starting my journey as a clinical teacher, this was actually my go-to journal. These are accessible pieces that we can read, that we can understand, but that we can integrate and we can apply to our teaching practice. And that is the nuts and bolts, really, isn't it, of scholarship in teaching and learning. And to have a place and a space for those good ideas to be shared with the wider clinical teaching community. And because we're a digital journal now, we don't have a print version as well. We've become even that much more accessible to a global community as well. But in terms of nurturing scholarship, I just wanted to kind of point out a couple of the initiatives that we've introduced in the last year and that were very much a follow-on from the previous editor, from Jill Thistlethwaite's vision. So this is not I don't get the credit for moving this forward. This was the trajectory we were on. And these were the spaces that we needed to fill. But certainly it was around that peer review and feedback. And again, we monitor where that feedback is coming in from and we try and keep an eye on that. But as a team, we actually do a serious amount of work on those papers. And a lot of the time, I'm sure some of you may have had that experience of Shubha, particularly, and I, and a couple of our other associate editors, we do the track changes on the Word document sometimes because it's easier than trying to explain where we feel a gap is in a paper. We put it into the Word version so that people can actually do something with that feedback very quickly. But we also created a new space within our journal, that educational scholarship to me, I know to Shuba, and I know to most of you, we think about scholarship now, not just as a hierarchy where research is the pinnacle, and this is where we all need to be going, but actually we have a range of scholarly activities that we can share with our clinical teaching community. And to create a space for that, we created this innovation implementation improvement section. The idea with that is that we now have a space to share for the good clinical teaching ideas that are very much designed and informed by scholarly work, by research, by literature, and, for example, maybe team-based learning or something like that, but that we also have a space for the emerging work that's happening in quality improvement using QI methodologies, be it IHI, model for improvement, or lean, and also the emerging work in implementation science. But the innovation piece is often those curriculum innovation ideas, the curriculum initiative that somebody's put in place. They've put in a reasonably solid evaluation method to see, did that innovation achieve its aims and objectives? And can this be shared with somebody else who can pick it up, follow the paper, and actually implement it in their own context and adapt it to what they need for their particular clinical teaching environment? We also have an insight section, and this section is very much designed to share experiences. It's a structured reflection on particularly, say, how somebody has taken a theory or taken literature, integrated it into their teaching, and the reflection on how that has worked, or the challenges or the barriers, or how somebody else might go about doing it and actually sidestep some of the barriers to doing something as well. And that section can be very useful. So in terms of impact, we don't have an impact factor at the clinical teacher, but by virtue of the types of work that we want to publish, we hope, and to some extent we can evaluate, that we have that impact in other ways on the day-to-day teaching practice for our readers as well. And I guess the other thing that we really want to make sure that people know is that our journal is very much a multi-professional journal. It's not totally reflected in the submissions we get at the moment, but we are on a mission to improve that. This is a space for every health professions education piece. It is not restricted to or limited to one particular discipline. And we are really, really trying to reach out to those underrepresented. When I say underrepresented regions, I mean regions where faculty development maybe has not been as well developed as in other areas, or in areas where it's an emerging discipline in itself, and where these researchers are actually trying to establish themselves in master's programs or PhD programs as well, that we try and create a space for them. So I guess are there any questions there, Christina, before I move on? I might stop sharing that for a second before I get into today's conversation. Were there any questions there in the chat box from anybody?
No, we didn't get any questions. I mean, I was just mentioning that I like that you walked us through the type of publication mechanisms you have, having some experience publishing in multiple types of health professions, education, literature. You realize sometimes, oh, I did not submit that to the right type of paper. I totally messed that up. And the editor's pointing it out to me. So I think what you're pointing to is not only knowing the journal, but knowing the types of papers that the journal publishes and really thinking about, is your work right for that particular type of submission? It's a deeper dive, and it's not always intuitive to figure out.
Exactly. And if that was one kind of hint or tip I could give everyone, you would be amazed at the number of submissions we get where somebody has not read the author guidelines. They've flicked through it to see that they're within the word count, and that's been it. And so for a lot of people who are taking that first step into publishing an educational research piece, you see this IMRAD design that is just not relevant or applicable to our particular journal, and is not, the way we expect to see something written. Similarly, we see maybe a toolbox submission, and actually it turns out it was written as a research paper. So those author guidelines are really critical in explaining the differences between those article types. And every journal has those article types, has different article types. So you can't just, as you say, assume one way of writing or one way of doing things. I would say as well that, to me, I've been very fortunate in the experiences I've had as an author, and had one particular one. And just, again, it was an issue where the peer reviewers literally were diametrically opposed on their views on this one paper I had submitted. and I didn't know what to do with it. And I reached out directly to the editor, just emailed them and said, what do you think I should do? They could not have been more helpful. And that's what this is. It's your submission to a journal is a conversation with the editor. And don't be afraid to reach out through the office when something is not clear. Don't let it be muddy. Just pick that, journal and then work with that editor to make that happen. Eric, do you have a question?
Just for myself and the audience, could you ever give, we'd be curious probably to the breakdown of those different types of submissions that you outlined, and many education journals have somewhat similar or different, but what is the proportion of submissions that you get into those groups? Is half direct research and the other half divides itself out? Any insight into that?
So I don't have the exact figures because ours has changed. And what was happening when I came in was we realized that we were getting a huge number of submissions to the research section that were not educational research. They were actually innovation designs, and we were rejecting them because we didn't have a place for them. What I now have is an option that instead of rejecting a paper, I can actually send that back to the authors and say, this isn't a research study, it's an evaluation of an innovation, but I actually have a space for that if you can reframe it. So we have a reject and rewrite decision. And some other journals, medical education has the same. So they may take something from research into really good stuff or into something else. Our innovation and teaching and learning in medicine has an innovation section, as does education for primary care. And they all have these different, so in our innovation section, what we ask for is an approach and a background. Why did you do this? What was the problem? What was the approach? And that means the education design, what theories informed this in terms of teaching and learning theories, as well as theories in terms of the content, and then an evaluation. And if you're going to evaluate a curriculum innovation, try and go beyond that learner level satisfaction. It doesn't mean much outside of your local institution. You all know the conversations that go on about student feedback and what its purpose is and its benefits, but also its limitations. And in the context of a wider global journal, that local, the students liked what we did, isn't really going to inform what somebody else can do. You need to move a little bit beyond that to what are the implications for somebody else in doing that situation. And by focusing on the design and being very explicit about the content and how it was designed, we can share that with the wider community as well.
Can I say something?
Of course.
Just a couple of things. I want to emphasize to all potential scholars that think also, is this a local journal, regional journal, national, international? So the clinical teacher is international. Therefore, if we are situated in North America, then we need to make sure the jargon is not limited to North America. So we do have to put in the extra effort to find out what does an intern mean in South Africa, for example. So that's one thing. So don't use local jargon or explain the local jargon. That's one. And the second thing is implications. We often stop at, we did this in our great institution, and therefore everyone in the world should read it. But it really isn't. And that's one thing Aileen drums into people, to authors, and implications for a local context, but implications for the world outside your local environment. So, and this is something I'd like to think about.
And every journal as well will have an example paper with their author guidelines. So in that situation, we work very hard on the example paper that we have for our innovation to get those implications as a really good example. So if you can think local, possibly national, and then what are the international? What could somebody else pick up your paper, do the same thing tomorrow in their context and adapt it for their discipline? And that's the people sometimes put in the implications, this needs more research. Well, everything needs more research. So, that's not really an implication of your study. In an innovation piece, in a research paper, that's different. So I would say, Eric, our number of research publications has reduced this year. Our submissions probably haven't changed, but they're converted to rewrites. And we've had a 64% uptake on our rewrite option when we've offered it in the last 6 months. So to me, that's potentially, I think it's like 46 authors who've had a second shot that they wouldn't have actually had a year ago. So for me, that's really important that we are offering authors this other avenue, and that people, particularly if students or trainees are submitting to us, you don't want that first experience to be negative where it was just this outright rejection. And I spend a lot of time on, letters I get from students, particularly, people I feel may be publishing for the first time or attempting to, that we really give them some guidance and direction as to why this isn't suitable right now, but what they could do to extend their work.
I mean, thank you. I think there's, just to reemphasize what you said, and I know we have to move forward, but if we all go, those of us who are old enough, go back 25 years, I mean, you really had a few journals where it was either educational research submission or it was kind of an editorial. And just to see these different types of scholarly options, I think are just so valuable. And it probably is one of the biggest awareness campaigns amongst, I think, interested new parties in medical education to realize all the opportunities that exist to get something scholarly out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for somebody like me, that's really important. I know I have a very pragmatic mind. I ask so what about everything I read. And for maybe other researchers, they're not so maybe caught up in what's the immediate implication. I am. And that's why this journal suits me, because this has to have some kind of implication for that reader who is generally a clinical teacher, and it has to have some implication for them too. So my feedback often will contain what is the so what of your study? And that, again, in a research context, has to link back to a research question. Again, the number of research papers that don't have a research question is always interesting as well. So were there any other questions in there, Christina, before?
Yeah, do we have time for one more question before we go to breakout rooms? Quickly.
Are you okay with that? Is that okay, Shiva?
The Jealous has a question. He's trying to figure out, you've got so many journals and so many publication mechanisms in journals, and some rules are loose and some rules are hard, and it can take hours to reformat your submission for a new journal. And he's just wondering if you have any thoughts on why there are so many differences between journals in terms of the submission requirements just to submit your paper to the journal.
I think, well, the first main issue is the platform that every publisher uses for submissions is different. So that's a big challenge in the first place. And that's hugely time consuming then if you're moving from a publication within one publisher to another. So we use Manuscript Central and Medical Education does. I'm not sure in terms of, I guess every journal has an ethos and it has a vision. And I think that's why it's important to really choose carefully. And that it isn't a case of just choosing the journal that has the highest impact factor for your paper. It has to have a fit. And if it's very obviously not a fit for that journal, you kind of feel like you have this hierarchy in your head of the journals to which you want to submit. But actually, it might be a better fit for the 5th journal on your list. So you save yourself 5 rewrites and make sure you look at their vision and their mission and whatever way they frame that on their websites. And you have to read. You have to read the papers that they publish and get a sense of what they do publish and the conversations for which they have space, and be familiar with that. Now, there's a paper actually just been published last week. Elliot Rees just wrote with a couple of authors in the UK, and they essentially did this huge survey of how and why people choose certain journals in which to publish. And I can get you the link, Christina, and I can send that on to you for everyone afterwards. But people do think about fit and impact and journal ethos, and also who's publishing in that journal, in the conversation, in that topic in which you're interested and trying to join that conversation. It's important to identify those platforms. But, technically it's every journal is a marketing strategy as well. It's a business, and I guess they all have individual ways of doing that as well. But they are hard to navigate when you start out.
So I think it's time for breakout groups. I was just trying to respond to Elizabeth Cacho's question. The Clinical Teacher is actually a sister journal for medical education, and they come from ASME, the Association for Study of Medical Education. Medical Teacher is completely different, and that is AME, Association for Medical Education in Europe. So different organizations, different journals, but actually Medical Teacher and Clinical Teacher have more in common than Clinical Teacher and Medical Education. With that, I will allow the breakout groups to form. We want the questions, right?
Yeah.
For the
I'll
breakout.
pop those up here. Yeah, let me pop those up there. So how many groups are we going to pop into, Shiva, in the end?
4.
Oh, great. So maybe 2 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to assign which rooms are going to ask which questions, 1 and 2 first
Yeah.
question, and 3 and 4 for the second question?
That's right. And so it's just as Aileen has written. So think just a little bit briefly about a paper that had an impact on you as an educator, and discuss in your groups why this particular paper. Don't discuss all the papers because we'll be well over time, but just think about the reasons this paper had an impact on you. And together, select a group reporter or a moderator, and they will come back and report like 3 bullets. Why did paper have an impact? Groups 3 and 4 will just talk about impact. So what's the difference between an impact factor and what are the kinds of impacts that a scholarly article might have? So that's groups 3 and 4. All right, we have about 20 minutes. All right, we're back with our expert. Who is the spokesperson for group 1?
Then that would be me. So that we had a fascinating conversation, and so we marched across and said independently for each of us what we thought was meaningful, and the things that came across were the novelty. Did this article make us think different? The practical, can I use what this article gives me immediately tomorrow? And then the match to my day-to-day interest, and so that across those two things, does it come across? And so that those were the things that were meaningful to us. And then we talked a lot about rabbit holes, and so that the utility of rabbit holes, and that the reading. And reading from journals, you can, kind of have your steady feed of things that gives it across, but serendipity has to play a role in here, and so how do you discover that article that makes you think different, and how's it make you do that? And so that we talked about airport bookstores and wandering into the self-help section and thumbing through the latest California theory on blank, so that those sorts of structures we need in our lives, and so in the end we all kind of nodded and thought rabbit holes were a great thing, and how do we incorporate that into our lives to the extent that the lack of efficiency of rabbit holes allows. So I'll stop rambling there, and in the group, anybody, Sarah or Irene, did I get that right?
Is everyone else seeing the article title in that, right? We can see that being developed there, Martin, already. I already have the title that I can just see in the journal, the heading about rabbit holes and airport bookstores. It's all set up for you. Go for it.
Good.
That's an insights article right there.
Insight into Self-Help by Martin.
But it's so true, isn't it? And it's the impact outside of, just a highly cited paper. It's those avenues you go down and the tracks you go on, and you get to generate this train of thought because you read so many different articles. And it's the combination of all that that's had the impact on your practice sometimes, isn't it? It's super.
So it's Eric's group also talked about the same question. Yeah.
So the question again was scholarly impact beyond the impact factor, and so how might any published article have impact? So I'll put together, I hope I do this justice, 3 kind of winding endpoints we kind of hit. I think we started with a reflection a little bit that many of us, most of us are kind of have grown up in the biomedical kind of scholarship world, where impact factor, this idea of who's quoting your article kind of is very important. But when you reflect on the social sciences, and Emily's now off the call, but she said she grew up in this area, it's more of a textbook that or not a book that you're writing, or a thought that you're generating that doesn't really rely on the peer review process to quite the same extent. And so that brought us to kind of the second point, which Omar brought up. Does the impact factor really matter one, because of that, but number two, because you can also put anything kind of on social media, and it often can be impactful just because the communication's out there, which brought us to this interesting kind of third crux of when you say scholarly impact, it implies scholarship. So take that word for what it is and build this Venn diagram of what is scholarship, what is communication, and how can they both impact? And it gets to be a very interesting kind of thought process there. That's where we ended. So it's a good 20 minutes.
And that's so true, isn't it, about the social media and the explosion in impact from that. And as you say, I mean, there are obviously big conversations going on around impact factor, mostly because we've moved into a digital era, I guess, in terms of journals. Obviously, TCT is completely online, and it's whether or not, you know, the citation is one thing, but that's really dependent on somebody else citing your work explicitly in another piece of work. Whereas actually, a lot of the time, the implications of your work will be on somebody's practice where they've downloaded it and read it, but actually you won't get the credit for that as a citation. But now that we can track the downloads through our journals, we have this other measure. So we give an award every year. We have our well, not that we give an award, but we talk about the 5 most highly cited papers in medical education and in TCT to give people a sense of what are people reading and what kind of impact that potentially is having. And as you say, then you tweet it out there and suddenly you have, you know, a couple of other 100 people at least reading your abstract, but that's not anything that you're going to be able to cite. So the impact factor as a metric is definitely about to have its own revolution.
Reckoning.
It is a bit of a day of reckoning. Absolutely.
Well, and just to add to that, when I get my monthly statistics from publishers and vendors in the field, not only are they looking at downloads, but they're looking at content views. So how many people are viewing the content that they're making accessible? How many are downloading? How many are printing? How many? And then sometimes I'll even get, I think, there might be one more that I'm just neglecting right now, but it's more than the downloads.
Yeah.
So we have group 3 was Aileen's group, Elizabeth, Jack, Christina. So who was the report?
I was appointed a reporter for our group. I think we had some fantastic discussion. We talked about a couple of things. I think the biggest picture thing is that we as a team felt like it's much more than impact factor, right? It's really about the papers that matter to us, that are impactful to us. Elizabeth really is into the OSCE, so there are papers that have helped her move her own work forward. Jack is a clinician educator, and he's talking about finding papers that he can apply in his real world setting right now. We also talked about the impact of when we publish something, how that makes us feel. I've learned a little bit from every single paper that I've published. Some of the papers I'm most proud of are papers that have not been highly cited for possibly reasons of what Aileen said earlier, maybe because they're, you know, just papers that aren't going to get picked up and published in a lot of journals, and that's okay because they're meaningful for me. And the other thing we talked about is, you know, a bit of this non-traditional scholarship, right? For example, I've got a couple of last pages out there. They're 1-page papers. They are a lot of work, but when you look at some of the alt metrics, because of the type of publication they are, those alt metrics are pretty high comparatively speaking. And so there are different ways of measuring impact. And we think that goes to how it can help you grow, how meaningful it is to you. And then of course, a bit of that name recognition and field recognition. So we had some really great conversation.
Thanks, Christina. And I will just summarize from our group, without repeating what other people have said. Our group talked about how can you have a true impact through your scholarship. One is application to real life practice, but real life practice adding to the field, but for the future with a futuristic view. And E particularly also talked about applicable to other contexts Vagelis talked about. So it's not just the global north or the Western concept, but also truly global context, impacting society in the long term, and then breaking free of the shackles of current status quo. I think the breaking the shackles was my own status quo, others said. So those were the unique points that came out of our group.
Yeah, what a super conversation. And I think we're all on the same page. But I think the point that I really wanted to make today is that, you know, particularly for those of you who are kind of at the beginning of this education scholarship journey, that you don't see research as the pinnacle, that there are other ways and means to have impact, and for your work to have meaning, and to not be deflated, you know, if an article is rejected. We hope that every journal does it in a nice, constructive way, but, you know, people are under pressure and peer review is under its own pressures at the moment, and I get all that. But at the same time, just that you have that reassurance and that confidence in your own work, that you have an impact every day in terms of the teaching that you do, the impact you have on your students, and by coming at it from a scholarly perspective where your teaching and learning is informed by scholarship and by research, that is an impact by itself. So it's just to kind of affirm that, if anything else.
That was fantastic. I just wanted to bring everything to a close by showing you, well, there are many types of scholarship. There's scholarship of discovery, which we are talking about 95% of the time, but scholarship goes beyond that. So scholarship of discovery is traditional research. Scholarship of application is what a lot of you are talking about, which is bringing it to real life. Scholarship of integration is becoming more and more recognized, at bringing concepts from other disciplines into your own, because they've been there, done that already. And why are we reinventing the wheel? And there's scholarship of teaching and learning, which really focuses on transformative learning, okay, not just informative learning. And finally, Ernest Boyer expanded the forms of scholarship to a scholarship of engagement, which is exactly what Yi spoke about. And I take on bigger, larger world problems, impact society. Now, as you know, a lot of people are talking about education and the environment, but I do want to leave you with one small quote, hang on, from the Dalai Lama. So we may have a small impact, like a little pebble into water, creating a small ripple, but the actual ultimate impact may go way beyond that little ripple. So that is my version or my interpretation of impact, which leaves me to thank Aileen for an absolutely wonderful discussion, as well as all the participants. And anything else, Eric?
No, that was your comparable quote to the butterfly flaps its wing and 4,000 miles away there's a hurricane, or some quote like that I'm getting terribly wrong, but completely agree. Thank you, Aileen. I thought that was a great discussion. I think all of the groups had fun. I really appreciate just seeing everyone too. It's so fun to get us together.
Thank you.
And thank you all so much. It was so lovely to be part of this.
Have a great day.
Thank you very much, Aileen.
Bye.